do. You guys must think I'm the dumbest person on the planet.
Oh, hello. This is Dave Little from Things I Thought About Today. And you are listening to Nursery, a podcast from Ohio's creative voice. But you knew that, right?
I feel lost like a speck in a pile out of sight. And though I try with all might, I just don't feel that strong. As we walk through a field trekking on snowy dirt, my eyes start to hurt trying to see a smile. And we talk about fears making our story short. You are scared to get shot, your bravery goes for miles. And there's more miles to go as we walk the train tracks. I think we lost the rain back in the woods we just hiked. And the store signs can glow as you walk sidewalk cracks. I think we lost the town back trading street lamps for kites. The nursery and all of the trees crossed over the dark. And some old parking lots hold my whimpering thoughts. And I'm on the next train, you and me. Can't you see what this means? In the light of a torch, realize nothing is forced, nothing is forced.
Hey guys, welcome to Nursery, a podcast from... it's fine. A podcast from Ohio's creative voice. I'm here with a couple of my immediate family. My name's Lee Boyle.
Karen Boyle.
Jack. and we're just going to have an impromptu conversation here. Just to start us off, the Beat Poets are a big influence on our family, and there's something that we have dealt with a lot as an influence on whether it be music, poetry, writing, conversation. Mom, you recently, this is the day before my birthday, you got me a Kenneth Rexroth book where he revisits some old classics. What's his tie to the Beat Poets?
What's his what?
Tie.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, this interview I read yesterday in 1963, the interviewer was asking Rexroth how he became a spokesman for the Beat Poets. And I thought Rexroth was kind of hesitant to take credit, not that he was full force behind the Beat Poets and did not question what Ginsberg and Kerouac were going to do, but he was puzzled that he had become this older person, the only older person who supported them. Mm-hmm. And he said he didn't know why that happened, except that he always paid attention to younger writers, and he could see that they were saying something and stuff like that.
He emceed one of their most famous readings in San Francisco, right?
Right, and that was one of the things he talked about, was how much, because, that was the invention of poetry readings. That was the first time that people thought that the public would want to hear poets. Now, that's not true. I mean, Amy Lowell and Ezra Pound did poetry readings that people came to a lot. But the whole idea of getting together people and doing it, traveling around, and Rex Roth.
Like making it a theatrical experience too, like making it less stuffy, or no?
Well, I think the beat poets, certainly Ginsberg, had that sense.
Yeah.
Rex Roth, I think, was like the person who, they were all in San Francisco, they all knew each other, and he gathered them together. He, and I think he was kind of like that, don't you? That he, he had a sense of valuing these writers, and then,
And for anyone who might be listening, if you don't know who Kenneth Rex Roth is, he has a book that you could start with called The Morning Star, which is a good start. I think it was near his last book. He pretended that he translated it from a female poet. Chinese, was it? Yeah. And told everybody he had translated, but really what he had done was write, kind of achieved one of the few instances where like a man wrote as a woman and convinced a lot of readers. So it's a good start to start with The Morning Star by Kenneth Rexroth if you like poetry, and you think you might like him if you like the beats. Jack, I was going to ask you, you were on the other side of the coin reading On the Road at one point. What did that book do for you? Would you recommend it to people, or was it good? Did it suck?
Yeah, I think it's a good book, but I think as a lot of people, I don't know, people have said this to me before, like that it's probably most suited to like 17, 18-year-old men, boys. Like,
so I kind of missed my window by not like.
Yeah, I mean, I still think you should read it and stuff, but there's a lot that just sort of seems like glorifying drug use and parties and stuff. Sorry about Lily. I had to close her in my room, and her friend Jeremy is here, and she wants to see him.
Yeah, people that you hear the dogs in the background. I know you're kind of used to it by now, but yeah, sorry about that. It's okay though.
But yeah, I mean, I would still recommend it, but kind of with some reservations, because I mean, I used to say it was like my favorite book. Now I think that there's a certain sort of like judgment you might have of somebody if they told you that On the Road was their favorite book, because it's like, it seems not very well organized in a lot of it. But I don't know, the descriptions of like jazz music and stuff like that seem to me to hold up as still really worthwhile and stuff like that. And I like just the movement and the excitement that the narrator feels and stuff like that.
You know, America was said to have invented jazz music, so it kind of was a culmination of like, oh, jazz was considered erotic at one point and like taboo, and poets grabbed onto that and tried to write accordingly and stuff. But when it took itself into a weird little like more of a flow like poetry, didn't you think Kerouac in particular was pretty bad at writing poems? Did you ever read it?
Oh yeah, his poetry's awful. But yeah. I don't really know if it, like, to me it really seems like he had some like hang-ups about what poetry was supposed to be, because like you could take a passage from On the Road that was just like a description of like going to a jazz club and listening to them, and like just put that, like just cut it out and put it like independently, and like I'd think that was a good poem. But I think he probably had ideas about what poetry was supposed to be and wrote a bunch of stupid stuff about like Buddhism and stuff that just didn't work. And I think it might have been just his own sort of, I don't know, his own barriers that he had against like what he thought poetry was supposed to be like, and trying to fit stuff into form, or what the subject might be. If he'd have been like more open-minded about what a poem could be, I think he might have written some decent stuff, because I think that a lot of the best passages of things he did write are very poetic, and sometimes they're mixed in so chaotically with other things that it almost seems like it might be preferable to read them as individual sort of accounts with their own sort of titles and stuff. And you know, if he'd have been more like a prose poet, or you know, if he just had 2 pages of text that he could have put together like that those would have made better poems, and perhaps it would have been less taxing than reading like 200 pages of it all at once.
Yeah. To
It might
actually have a
almost be
simple
like
form of
a
just
presentable,
prose.
sort of format. So it's almost like, I think he was a good poet, but he didn't show it in any of his poems.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, you and I have even had moments where we trim the fat on each other's poems because we think we're supposed to be more structured. And it's like he had that same disease times 10 where he thought a poem had to be this certain thing and he couldn't just tell a story without it seems like the poems are like just taking the details, like taking some of the like explanation out and it turns into a poem. Like you just take a story, pull out the stuff that like leaves exposition and you have a poem sometimes. But
That's so interesting that you say that, because that's exactly what Rex Roth said about all the beat poets. He says they can all write. He gave an example of going to see Ginsberg and said, I started this poem about my mother and I have 50 pages. I don't know what to do with it. And Rex Roth goes, I don't know what. They all just do that. They all just like write a whole bunch of stuff and some of it's really bad. But he praised Mexico City Blues as a good collection
Jack
of poetry.
Kerouac.
Yeah.
Okay.
Rex Roth thought, he was good on poetry.
see, I'm pretty sure I read some pieces of that. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
And I didn't think the
I've
same.
never liked the poetry very much, but
The stuff he
I think
stood
what
for,
you
but-
said exactly. And also Rex Roth talked about jazz, and he said a funny thing was, and I think he said what they do with jazz is good and important. Nobody else has tried to do anything like that except Leroy Jones, Amory Baccarat. But he said poets always think they know about music and they never do, which I thought was funny thing.
Yeah, I find myself changing gears a lot in order to, if Jack and I and Peppy were to write a song for third class, I find myself taking way more liberty, being like, oh, a lot of more stuff sounds good over music than it does on paper and poetry, and that's the difference to me, is that like you can rhyme, you can put kind of more casual like sentences in when you're doing songs, but with poetry you have to keep cutting the fat. Songs you don't have to do that. You can tell a story more. But,
I don't think Rex Roth could have imagined people like they are now being in bands and writing poetry and stuff, but I think he was criticizing people for thinking you just put a little jazz music behind your poetry and that'll make it all good or something.
Right. Do you guys like when you turn the light on Allen Ginsberg, another person who sometimes could be considered a father of his influence besides Rex Roth is William Carlos Williams, he wrote Patterson about New Jersey, and he wrote and Allen Ginsberg wrote a lot of poems about New York and stuff, and they did a lot of East Coast as well as West Coast poetry. Like they kind of covered a lot. Do you think William Carlos Williams has a place like in that scene? He's never really considered super part of it, right? But he's kind of one of the fathers of that influence, right?
I'm trying to remember something I just read recently that did actually say that, and it might have been that interview, because William Carlos Williams is so much older and always considered in with Eliot and Pound, which I think Rex Roth said he had no use for.
Yeah.
But William Carlos Williams, I don't think gets the credit. I mean, Ginsberg always gives him the credit, but I don't think William Carlos Williams gets the credit for being as different from and starting a whole new type of poetry. Or some people, I've seen current poets say we should blame William Carlos Williams for all these people who are writing poetry that's not any good and stuff like that. But I think he's the beginning.
Yeah, he's good. He like all the stuff in Patterson's awesome.
Yeah.
And then
and he was amazing that he recognized Ginsberg. I mean, what Ginsberg may have done nothing without William Carlos Williams' encouragement.
right. And I think later in life Ginsberg visited him when he was close to death and stuff like that.
Yeah, and then William Carlos Williams quoted Ginsberg's letter in Patterson.
Oh, yeah, okay, right.
But yeah, and one thing I think sad about William Carlos Williams' life is he was very depressed at the end of his life. Because he had a stroke, and I think he couldn't do things he wanted to do, but he never got the recognition.
Yeah.
You know, that.
And he's stuck with a really, really reliable job the whole time too.
Yeah, I mean, people, you know, and like you're saying about Kerouac, when you're young and you think like, oh, that's the greatest. He just traveled and he did all this stuff, and you don't even think about how much are they just using drugs and doing nothing else with their lives, you know?
Yeah.
But that goes the other way too. William Carlos Williams married with a good job as a doctor. Oh, can't be a poet if you do that.
Yeah. No, I know. What, were you gonna say something?
Well, yeah, I just think like it's people do say things like, oh, he was really influential to all of those poets, but like his lifestyle is completely different than theirs. Like, so it seems like somehow you can't like fully say it. You can say like he was like a really important influence, and like I definitely think that like he changed I think he changed a lot about the way people thought about poetry, but I don't think that, you know, I mean, he wasn't, you know, doing speed and stealing cars and doing stupid shit like that. And however important you think that is to what the Beat Generation means, I think sometimes it's more important than what they actually wrote.
Yeah,
I mean, some of
the way they conducted themselves, yeah.
That it was a lifestyle.
And that's how,
that
like to me is a lot of the measurement of whether or not like a person from the Beat Generation is worth reading, because it's like, is it their persona or their actual writing that's important? And like, and I think Kerouac rides that line a lot. Like, I think On the Road and Dharma Bums are both worth reading, but I don't know what I think about like. But when it comes to his poetry, I'm like, that's not important literature, like in terms of like, it's just like that doesn't hold up in the same way. And it like, or you know, like Neil Cassidy hardly wrote anything. But he was really important to the other beat poets, and they wrote about him. And to me, like, William Carlos Williams is so far away from all of that.
I think you're right, and I think, you know, I think you shouldn't discard that influence of a lifestyle. But I just want to make one little defense of William Carlos Williams, and that is he lived in New Jersey, but he went to New York City every week, and he went to all the opening modern art shows. And I think that's really interesting. I don't know about him in relation to jazz, but I know he's very influenced by modern art and the stuff. And I know, you know, he has those poems on Bruegel, who wanted to be considered, you know, a 20th century artist. But I think he was very influenced by a New York City lifestyle that we don't think of him as being.
Right. And it's funny, once you get down to the fact of all these poets that we associate together, let alone the beat ones, they're all really different from each other. And it's funny, you think they're all the same, but it's like Ginsberg was like a self-promotional, you know, like hippie. Right. Kerouac was kind of the cool guy. Rex Roth was their grandfather, and, you know, had it organized and had more of a, you know, talked a lot more about the constellations and weird, you know, he had more like referential stuff, actually kind of close to Pound, even though he didn't like him sometimes. And then Gary Snyder like invented, you know, had a hand in starting Earth Day and had way more environmental concern than like 100 times more than any of the other guys did, and wrote about logging in California and stuff. So like they're all pretty. And then Lawrence Ferlinghetti was kind of more, he just organized things and wrote some poems. Like
that's
they're
why
all
it's
really
funny
different.
to read
like,
about their lives, because it's funny to think of what they said about each other too. Like, you know,
they were all
even
really
Ginsberg and Kerouac like really criticized each other a lot, because you can imagine them. I mean, such totally different backgrounds. And
Gary Snyder kind of wrote a lot of better poems than a lot of them, but then he removed himself a little bit by becoming like a regular teacher and lecturer and environmentalist and stuff.
I don't know what all he did to separate himself off, though. I think
he just didn't promote as much. I feel like he kind of went under the radar on purpose.
Yeah, I
and
do
stuff.
too. I think his personality. I mean, that's what's. Some people think that the beat poets would have never been known at all without Ginsberg, because he was
Yeah, I
the
think that's
businessman.
true. I
He
think
was the
that's
one
true.
that promoted everybody,
I
and
think
that's the
it's
way
true,
Hahn
but-
was too for his generation. What if you don't have somebody like that? And Snyder would have never. He didn't want a part of that.
Right.
That wasn't his personality.
Right. He's more into talking about the environment and things like that. Like,
Yeah,
that's his platform.
and Ginsberg can talk about Buddhism, and I guess they were different aspects of Buddhism that they argued about in terms. Ginsberg and Snyder were different, but I mean, I do think Snyder, he had more of a sense of putting that stuff into operation in his own life.
Yeah. And then, and I have to mention, just since we touched on William Carlos Williams, like he's a big influence on me and Jack and Pepe in third class, because we have an album called The Red Wheelbarrow, and that's because his poem named the same name is so minimal and has almost nothing to it, yet is good. And I think that says a lot about like people we know and the influence they've had from, like, whether it's punk or pop art or beat poets and stuff. I think that stuff seeps into a lot of stuff that most people I know do.
Yeah.
And that stuff deserves a big. When David Bowie died recently, like, I don't listen to him, I don't really care, but I know that I owe him like big for paving some way of, like, the way my generation things that my generation thinks are okay, especially in art and whatever else. But I'm saying, you know, like, even if no one listened to him, they owe kind of some gratitude to him and maybe the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed, and wherever, however far you want to go.
Yeah.
But speaking of, like, just the beat poets and just that kind of influence, the era where you were actually living in during the time when that started burgeoning, like early 60s to late 70s, you were, before we pressed record, you were talking about Vietnam as a backdrop. Like, what was that like for you personally to, like, see, as far as, like, war versus the counterculture? Yeah.
Well, I graduated from high school in 1967, so a lot of the guys that I graduated with signed up to go off to war immediately. We knew about the war and we talked about it. I didn't know anything. I just thought, Vietnam is too far away.
Yeah.
Until I was in college, and then from 67 to 71, that's when the students were protesting the most, and I got involved in that. I would say, you know, I went into nurses training. Again, I'm not paying much attention to the political situation until the second year of college. And I would say, now I'm just making this up right now, but I think I have said this many times, I became an English major because of Ginsberg. And it was a required English class that we had to read the beat poets. We read On the Road, and we read Howe and Kadish, and that had a big influence on me. And I would say it might have, this is what I've never thought of before, it might have influenced me to protest the Vietnam War, because it certainly influenced me to think more for myself. And I'd have to say I'm probably like Jack in terms of my first reading of On the Road was, I just said, I thought all that stuff was good.
Yeah, right.
And it didn't mean that I went out and did a bunch of drugs and that, but it was a supportive of a way of life that I didn't support when I was growing up.
Right.
I was raised differently. But part of that, I think, and I said this to Jack the other day, almost, any group of poets or musicians or something, you can talk about all the drugs and alcohol, but there's something else going on there separate that doesn't. So the jazz, their sense of you're allowed to rebel was a part of. And then, of course, we had teachers, English teachers, who were encouraging us to go to war protests in Pittsburgh. Bill and I did, and we went to Pittsburgh, and then I was saying before we did the recording that 1970, I wouldn't say that I really got angry until the Kent State students were killed.
Yeah,
and
because you were a student at that point.
I was at Youngstown State, and by that time I had finished the nursing degree. I was still working as a registered nurse, but I was working on the BA in English. And do you know this story that this was May 1970. I was working at what was Cafaro as a general duty hospital, and I told my supervisor that I was going to go to Washington, D.C. to protest the Vietnam War, because there was a big Washington, D.C. protest after the Kent State students were killed. I had gone in the November before then to Washington, D.C. too, but then after the students were killed, I went. And I told my supervisor, which I always think is funny, that I said, you know, I have to take time off work because I'm going to go. And she said, just be careful. So, and then, as I said when we were talking too, that's when the draft happened, and they didn't do the draft. At first, the draft, if you were in college, you didn't get drafted, but then they changed it to, I always forget what it was called, but it was a number. You got a number, and then you were drafted by your number. So that was a lot scarier because you didn't have any ways of getting out of it, except which, you know, a lot of people did, which took a lot of courage to just like burn their draft card or something like that. But,
which back then, now in hindsight, you think, oh, that's all it took. Whereas now we'd be attached to some internet confirmation number, or some confirmation number through a few systems in the U.S.
You mean to get drafted?
Yeah, I'm not sure how it would work now if it happened, but I'm saying, like, back then, maybe them burning that card was enough to cut ties. Because there wasn't...
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't?
That's what's,
okay.
Yeah, that's what's interesting, because
they'd still find you.
Like, I feel like, yeah. And they would just take you off to jail. If you burn your draft card, you could just get arrested and go to jail. So they did. Lots of those people that did all that stuff, you think like, oh, they were just drunk or stoned or something, they did that. No, they were very seriously making the decision because they knew they were going to jail. And that was in May 1970 when I went to Washington, D.C. I got really scared because at first it was just like, oh, you can protest this war, and I'm going to go to a protest, so I'll do this to gather up. But when I was there with Bill in May 1970, students started breaking windows in the store windows. Like it was nighttime, and we were with a bunch of people running down the street, and some people had baseball bats, and they took them out and they started smashing the windows. And then we got tear gassed, and you know, that's not fun, and it makes your face hurt. And I was really scared because all the police surrounded us. And you know, once you know that how the students got killed at Kent State, it's a lot scarier to be around. You know then what, you know, everybody should know, how quickly someone can draw a gun or how quickly bad things can happen. But I realized that I wasn't willing to break store windows, and I couldn't do that. And when we came back to Youngstown, we had several friends who spent days in jail in Washington, D.C. After that protest, and you know, they just talked about it, and I thought, I hate to admit this, but I was just a real coward about doing anything like that. You know, I could talk against that war, but I couldn't really go and put my life on the line the way I think some people, I mean, that's what I think people just think, oh, it's just a bunch of kids who weren't thinking. I guess that's the main thing I'd like to correct about my whole generation is, yeah, there were a lot of people, like this one guy who wrote a book about Kent State, and he says, oh, we just went to all the protests to find girls, and it was just a way to get dates. You know, no, I know there were a lot of people doing that, but I was pretty serious. I was reading a ton of books about the Vietnam War, and lots of people were a lot more serious than I was in terms of what they were willing to do and how bad, what a terrible thing they thought that was that our country was doing. It wasn't just nonviolence, too. You know, of course, if you read the history of that war and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, and I think probably a lot more people than you would know, especially coming from this area, probably had those same intentions to an extent. But it's just hard to see that, especially coming from Youngstown.
Well, I think it's in the interest of the whole culture to make my generation look foolish, as if it was all drugs and just fun and games.
Plus, I also think that at the time, a lot of people were rolling their eyes at certain things, and now they take them more seriously, too.
Well, so true. People have seen more. You can look back now and see more of, because more people do, I think, not everybody, of course, but see that the Iraq War was a huge mistake, just the way the Vietnam War was.
Yeah, and I heard a quick interview with a comedian, Zach Galifianakis, on a podcast called WTF with Mark Maron, which is a big podcast, and he had this moment where he's talking about he bought a house on a farm or something, somewhere in the U.S. Zach did, and he was saying it's in kind of a communal area, and Mark asked him, does he like being around like hippies? And Zach said, yeah, because at the end of the day, they're always right. I thought that was a pretty fun comment. Like, it was kind of nice. Like, I'm not trying to promote an agenda on this podcast other than just being creative in Ohio, but it was fun to hear him say that, because he was like, yeah, everybody thought it was so hilarious and ridiculous and stupid when they talked about global warming, when they talked about this, and he's like, and they're just right. They're right at the end of the day. Maybe that's a pretty bold thing to say that somebody, even we, might not agree with all the time, but it was fun to hear him blanket statement that and just be of course they're always right.
I get it. You know, I don't really, as much as I want to defend myself as having been a hippie, I don't even like the word, and I don't even, I don't support continuous use of marijuana to your 65, and I don't support, sort of a lot of what has become these old hippies talking. But I would say on his comment, what I would say is that I said that to my friend Carol Bretz recently. Nothing is happening now that we didn't know was going to happen 40 years ago. Yeah. And that is global warming. That is, people did know this stuff. Everybody acts like, oh, I just figured out I should eat organic. Oh, I just figured out that global warming is happening. And you're like, yeah, why weren't you listening to anything 40 years ago?
Yeah, it's not so much a leftist agenda as it is like, oh, there's a couple of things you should be careful about, even if you don't have all the facts in front of you that seem obvious, to take care of the earth in a way. That's what's fun. That's how I think of it. I know I'm being biased, obviously, but well, okay, then let's just sign off with like a book recommendation to listeners. Just recommend one book to who you think our listeners are.
It doesn't have to be the Beat Generation.
No, it doesn't have to be anything.
My current favorite, very favorite, is Strong As My Hold by Galway Kinnell. His poem that I love the best is, I can't remember the title of it, Quick and the Dead. Quick and Dead. Quick and the Dead. The Quick and the Dead.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, Jackie, you have a recommendation?
Thinking I don't know. I have like the Beat Generation stuff in my head now, but I don't know what I would recommend. I mean, we talked about On the Road. I think Dharma Bums is probably more palatable than On the Road is for people to read. I mean, it seems, I don't know, if the language of On the Road annoys you with how sporadic and spontaneous it seems, Dharma Bums is a little bit more digestible. Maybe I'll recommend Dharma Bums because I think it gets overlooked in the shadow of On the Road.
That's cool. Yeah, Dharma Bums, Jack Kerouac. I just that just popped into my head. I didn't have a plan for this, but I guess I'm gonna recommend to listeners The Call of the Wild by Jack London, because I think he's a good example of somebody who, especially at the end of that book, in the last like third, takes poetry into storytelling really well, and does like a big description of a trained dog going back to the wild, and he just does a really good job, but doesn't need much plot for him to get there, and it's very poetic.
I want to recommend from the Beat Poets, Kaddish, and I'm not sure that's even how you say it, but Ginsberg's long poem is my favorite.
Kaddish, okay, yeah.
Yeah. It's about his mother and her death and his feeling of responsibility for decisions he made, because he made the decision for her to have a lobotomy.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't realize that.
Which is what the doctors told him had to happen, and it was, and that's not a fun thing.
I have another recommendation that's not Beat that I just thought of. The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon is, I think, must have been, I don't know, probably written 10 years ago or something like that, maybe even a little bit. Well, that sounds about right. I don't know if you need a date on that.
Yeah.
But it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's about two kids who start their own comic book company during World War II, and it's pretty good. It's like it's epic. I mean, it's a long book, but it's really good. Yeah, that's all. I guess
That's cool.
I just thought of it. I guess I don't know why. Oh, there's this like part. Well, anyway, yeah. I just like when you said the thing about Jack London, I started thinking about like Alaska, or I don't know where the Call of the Wild set. Is it Alaska?
Yeah.
I can't remember. I think
it is.
And there's this part where the main character goes to the Arctic for some reason. I don't even remember why, but it's because he signs up for the military and is stationed in the Arctic Circle, and is like sort of alone in like a little place working a radio, and just it's a really memorable scene that's late in the book.
What's that book called again?
The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay.
By who?
Michael Chabon.
Michael Chabon. Cool.
C-H-A-B-O-N.
C-H-A-B-O-N. Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks, guys. And I'm going to take us out with, I guess I'll recommend a poem by Allen Ginsberg called A Supermarket in California. Had a huge influence on our music. I'm going to take you out with a song called Hey There Lullaby that kind of pays tribute to our now deceased father, but uses, tons and tons from that poem, A Supermarket in California by Allen Ginsberg. Thanks for listening, guys. Signing off, I'm Lee Boyle.
Jack.
Karen Boyle.
See you guys.
I can't believe I said all that crap.
Hey there, I need you to open up the door. With magic, I see you at the grocery store. And on the green light, wave me go ahead. With magic, the stars bright, it's time to go to bed. And if you could see what our lives grew to be, I think you would be proud of me.
This is them speaking right now. Hi, is anybody there? Hello, this is Lee. This is Jerry. This is
Nursery is sponsored by the Orange Avocado. Check them out on Facebook, and sponsored by the Speaking of Music show at YouTube. Would you like to sponsor an episode of Nursery? It's cheap, it's good promotion to a sweet demographic, and it's as many episodes or as few as your little heart desires. Email us at chlograve@gmail.com, CHLOEGRAVE@gmail.com, with the subject line sponsorship, and we will give you the hookup. Thanks for listening. We hope you're having as much fun as we are.